Hi class, and welcome to another day. We're on section 5-5 today. We're simplifying radicals, and more specifically, we're simplifying the radical of the square root. So whenever you see something that looks like this, you assume that it's the square root of something. We have the cube root of some numbers. We could talk about the fourth root, but today we're not talking about those. We're always talking about the square root. And whenever you don't see a number up here, it always is assumed that it's the square root of something. So you're very familiar with a lot of these, such as like 1, 2, the square root of 25. You guys know that 5 times 5 is 25, so the square root of 25 is 5. And this just means it's a negative 1 multiplied by the square root of 25, so it's a negative 1 times 5, obviously would then just be a negative 5. So our answer to problem number 1 is a negative 5. For number 2, it's plus and minus the square root of 49, so it's plus and minus 7. There's our answer to problem number 2. Take a look at problem number 3, a little bit of a tricky one. The square root of a negative 16. What times what gives a negative 16? Well, 4 times 4 gives a positive 16. And then if we talk about a negative 4 times a negative 4, that gets us a positive 16. So what gives us a negative 16? In this case, there is no real answer. There's no two integers that I can multiply by each other to get a negative 16, so I can't take the square root of a negative 16 and get a real answer. So for number 3, the answer is there is no real answer. For number 4, you're going to take the numerator and the denominator individually and take the square root. So the square root of 529, if you ever need to find out in your calculator, it's second x squared. That gets you the square root button. So it's the square root of 529. That is the number 23. And then it's also the square root of 2025. So once again, second x squared, 2025. So our answer is 23 over 45. 23 over 45, and once again there's a negative 1 on the outside, so it's a negative 23/45. There's our answer to problem number 4, and for number 5 it's going to be plus and minus the square root of 0.0625. I'll put that in my calculator again. Second square root 0.0625. And I get 0.25. So 0.25 times 0.25 is 0.0625. So the square root of 0.0625 is 0.25. So start off pretty basic. I hope all of that made sense too. Now we're going to hop down into numbers that are not perfect squares. There's no number times itself. Sorry, there's no integer multiplied by itself that gets you a 98. So you can't take the square root of 98 and get an integer. If you look in your calculator right here, if you take the square root of 98, you get 9.8994937. It's not an integer. And so by simplifying this, we want to have radicals in our answer. So we don't want decimals, but we want to have it in its most simplest form. So what I mean by that is we want to break this down into numbers that we can take the square root of. If I look at 98, I can say that this is the same thing as 49 multiplied by 2. So if it's 49 times 2, I know that I can take the square root of 49. The square root of 49 is 7. So I get 7, and then the square root of 2, I can't simplify it, so I'm not going to break it down any further. I'm just going to say it's 7 multiplied by the square root of 2. The square root of 98 is the same thing as saying 7 times the square root of 2. And let me prove that to you. The square root of 98 was 9.899, so on and so forth. And if I say 7 times the square root of 2, I should get the exact same thing, 9.899. Boom, 9.899. So those two are saying the exact same thing, but what I want you to do is I want you to have your answers like this, because this is simplified radical form. I don't want it unsimplified. Okay, so for number 6, our answer is 7 square root 2. Let's try number 7. Our goal here is to find the highest squared number that goes into 300. So the highest squared number that goes into it is 100. It's 100 times 3. So I can take the square root of 100, that comes outside the radical, the 3 stays inside. So 10 square root 3 is my answer for problem number 7. We keep on practicing. I have 3 multiplied by the square root of 125, which is the same thing as 25 times 5. I can't take the square root of 125, but I can take the square root of 25. So this comes outside, so now I have 3 times 5 square root 5. And this 3 times 5 is the same thing as 15. So my answer is 15 square root 5. Let me go through that again. This 25 times 5 is the same thing as 125, and then I have a 3 multiplied by that. So when I simplify this and bring out the 5, it's 5 times 3, which gives us the 15. I can't simplify the square root of 5 anymore, so that stays in my answer, 15 square root 5. Let's practice this a couple more times. So we have problem number 9, 2 square root 128. My goal here, class, is to find the highest squared number that goes into this one underneath the radical. So 4 goes into 128, that's great, but it's not the highest squared number. 9, maybe 16 goes into 128. Again, it's not the highest number that goes in there. The highest squared number that goes into 128 is 64. So this is the same thing as 2 square root 64 times 2. 128 is the same thing as 64 times 2. So I'm not changing anything, I'm just making it look a little bit different. 128 is the same thing as 64 times 2. So now I can take the square root of 64, it's 8. So now I have 2 multiplied by 8 times, this is left, the square root of 2. And 2 times 8 is 16. So my answer is 16 square root 2. Whenever you want to, class, you could always check these answers in your calculator to give you some more confidence. 2 times the square root of 128 is what we started off with. Let's say 2 times the square root of 128. I put that in my calculator, and I get 22.627. And we said that when we simplified it, it's the same thing as 16 square root 2. Well, let's put 16 square root 2 in our calculator. 16 times the square root of 2, we had better get the exact same thing if we did it right, of 22.627. Bam! 22.627. Isn't that good stuff? You can check your work on each and every one of these. Works out really nice. Let's move onward. Problem number 10. Square root 3 times square root 24. My rule of thumb here, class, is whenever you can simplify a radical, do that first. So you can't simplify square root 3, but you can simplify square root 24. So I'm going to bring the square root 3 down to the next line, and I'm multiplying by the square root of 6 times 4, because 6 times 4 is the same thing as 24. I can't do anything with this 6, but I can do something with that 4. I can bring it out. The square root of 4 is 2. So I still have this square root 3. Now I'm multiplying it by 2 times the square root of 6. Now my radicals are simplified as far as they'll go, so now I'm just going to multiply these two. Here's what you're going to do, class. The coefficients you multiply by each other. So square root 3 is the same thing as 1 square root 3. So I'm going to multiply my coefficients of 1 times 2 and get 2. And I'm going to multiply my radicals of square root 3 times square root 6. So whenever you multiply radicals, you multiply the coefficients by each other and you multiply the radicals by each other. So square root 3 times square root 6 is square root 18. So I get 2 square root 18. A lot of people will circle their answer once they get to this, but make sure you simplify your radical as far as it will go. Square root 18 can be simplified even further. It breaks down into 9 times 2. So now I have 2 square root of 9 times 2. 9 times 2 is 18. So I could bring out this 9, because the square root of 9 is 3. So now I have this 2 on the outside, and now I have a 3 on the outside with the square root of 2 underneath the radical. And now I can multiply 2 times 3, and I get 6 square root 2. Whew! A lot of stuff in that one. My answer, 6 square root 2, is how I simplified square root 3 times square root 24. Number 11. So once again, we're going to multiply the numbers by each other and multiply the radicals by each other. But we're not going to do that until we simplify the radical as far as it will be simplified. So this 8 is the same thing as 4 times 2. So now I have 10 square root 2, because this 4 got brought out as a 2, and 2 times 5 is 10. So 5 square root 8 is the same thing as 10 square root 2. Let's simplify this part. This is the same thing as 4 times the square root of 16 times 3. 4 times the square root of 16 times 3. So now this 16 can be brought out as a 4, and 4 times 4 is 16 square root 3. So now I have 10 square root 2 times 16 square root 3. You multiply the coefficients by each other. 10 times 16 is 160. And you multiply the radicals by each other. Square root 2 times square root 3 is square root 6. Always check to make sure that your radical is completely simplified. If you could take something out, make sure you do that. But I can't take a squared number out of 6, so my answer is left like this. 160 multiplied by the square root of 6. So that's what we have for simplifying radicals. When we don't have a perfect square radical, we have to break it down and simplify it. So those are those problems. Moving on here, we're simplifying radicals with a number in the denominator. So just as we did in the previous slide, we multiplied the coefficients by each other, and we multiplied the radicals by each other. The same is going to be true of these type of problems. We're going to divide the coefficients by each other, and we're going to divide the radicals by each other. So let's do that quick. 4 divided by 1 is 4. 72 divided by 6, when you take 72 and you divide it by 6, you get 12. So you get 4 times the square root of 12. This would be your answer if you can't simplify it any further. However, you can simplify 12 to be 4 times 3. So now you have, bringing out this 4, as the square root of 4 is 2, you'd have 4 times 2 square root 3. And 4 times 2 is 8. So you get 8 multiplied by the square root of 3. That's your answer for problem number 12. Let's review that one more time. We divide the coefficients. So 4 divided by 1 is 4. You divide the radicals. So 72 divided by 6 is 12. So you get the square root of 12. And then we break down that 12. Our final answer, 8 square root 3. Let's try number 13. So we're going to divide the coefficients. 54 divided by 6 is 9. Divide the radical. 6 divided by 2 is 3. So we keep that underneath the radical. 9 square root 3. Can this be broken down any further? No, it cannot. So this is our answer. Number 14. You try this one on your own. Pause the video. Take a couple minutes, or take a minute or so here to try to figure this out on your own, and then check your work with mine. You divide the coefficients, and you get 3. You divide the radical, and you get square root 5. And that is as far as you can go for this one. The answer is 3 square root 5. I hope this video made sense to you. Be sure to let me know if you have any questions when you get to class tomorrow.